Good morning.
Good morning.
I am here with John Jack Mountcastle, General John Jack Mountcastle. We're here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. My name is Laura Stoner, and I'm here with Dr. Emily Raymond, and Paige Newman, and Danny Flakes. We're all here helping to interview you about your Vietnam experience.
Okay.
So we're going to start with, what is your full name?
John, middle name Wyndham, named after the doctor that delivered me, Wyndham Blanton, Mountcastle.
And
Known since early childhood as Jack.
where were you born?
Richmond, Virginia.
And what were your parents' names?
My father was Warren M. Mountcastle Jr. My mother, Florence Louise Wells Mountcastle. And they were both here in Richmond, although my mother had been born in Rhode Island. And so in those early days when Richmonders would say, "And where are you from, honey?" She would say, "Providence, Rhode Island," as if to say, "All right, you want to make some of it?" But she was great. She was a great Virginian, you know.
Adopted Virginian.
Yeah, exactly.
What did your parents do for a living?
My dad worked for what was formerly the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, now just part of CSX. My mom, before I came along, I was the firstborn, I had a younger sister, had worked after graduating from John Marshall High School in Richmond. She had worked as a stenographer and a secretary for several delegates in the State General Assembly, and then she worked for a while with an insurance firm here. Then I came along, and that was during World War II. And because my father worked for the railroad, and because he'd already completed military service before World War II broke out, they didn't draft him. They said, "No, you're in an important industry, the railroads." So they took me, about that big, I guess, and we went out to Chicago for a year and lived out there while he worked to ensure that, you know, war production made it to the Atlantic coast and onto ships and off to the battlefronts.
So what was your younger sister's name?
Kathleen,
Okay. And
born on St. Patrick's Day, therefore, nice Irish name, Kathleen.
And so where did you attend high school?
Thomas Jefferson High School.
It seems like they had a lot of wonderful graduates out of Thomas Jefferson.
In addition to me, of course. When I was going to high school back then, there were two city high schools for white kids, Thomas Jefferson and John Marshall. And then we had two high schools for black kids. And we didn't go to school together. All that seemed so strange to our two sons, you know, growing up, and especially growing up as they did in an army family, moving around, and their classmates were from every part of the country and from several different parts of the world. But back then it was a segregated school system.
Did you have many interactions with the black community in your childhood?
Not really, because I grew up in Ginter Park, and there were no black families in our neighborhood, and that all changed later, of course, but when I finished high school and applied to and was accepted at Virginia Military Institute, it was all male, all white school. It wasn't until later that the first black men came to VMI, and then later still, the first women applied and were accepted and came to VMI.
Did you, you said your father had military service. What did he?
Yeah, he served in the Virginia National Guard for 4 years in the 30s. Mm-hmm. And I think had he not completed his enlistment in the National Guard, he probably, even though he was a little older and they had I was born in December 1942, so when they started increasing the draft calls, 43 to 44, and they really did, the Army began taking people in who couldn't really see very well or chew very well. A lot of things that would have kept them out of the draft and right after Pearl Harbor. As the U.S. began to run out of foot soldiers, they said, oh, well, you didn't really have to see that well. A sergeant will tell him where to shoot, so yeah, you'll do. Head on down to Fort Benning.
So do you think that that had any influence in you picking BMI as your, the military service of your dad?
No.
No? Okay.
No, what had the influence was my mother, who was, by the time I graduated from high school, widowed. My father died when I was just 14. Mother went back to work, back to the insurance field, and did a marvelous job. And when it's time to apply for colleges, I applied to the University of Richmond and was accepted. That was, in those days, a Baptist school. Almost everyone there was from Richmond, either at West Hampton College or Richmond College. I applied to University of Virginia, and I applied to BMI. And I was still waiting on a letter back from Charlottesville when the letter came from Lexington saying, okay, you're accepted. I said, well, I got this letter here from BMI, Mom, but I would really like to go to Gilead. Son, you can go wherever you're accepted, but I'll only pay for you to go to BMI. And because she knew how badly I needed a very structured environment, and she was quite right.
So almost like a male influence.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure.
So now, what year did you graduate high school?
I'm sorry?
What year did you
Oh,
graduate?
1961.
1961. So when did you first remember hearing about the conflict in Vietnam or becoming aware of it?
Oh, by 1963, the United States had increased the number of advisors to the South Vietnamese government, which of course was the non-communist government in the Vietnamese area. Ho Chi Minh headed the communist northern part of Vietnam. And we began to become aware that more and more American troops were being sent to Vietnam. Concern about domino theory. If this non-communist government based in Saigon should fall, then what will be next? Thailand, Cambodia, Laos. The Chinese are providing weapons to the North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese are sending more and more trained troops across the international border into the south. And so by the time I graduated in '65, we had more VMI graduates serving there, either as Army officers, as Marine officers, or as Air Force officers. And that would go on for another 6 or 7 years. Then the VMI class just behind mine, the class of '66, shares a sad similarity with the West Point class of '66. If you go to West Point, go into Thayer Hall and the North Auditorium, there's a long list of names of West Point graduates killed in action in Vietnam. The class of '66 has the largest number. If you go to BMI's archives, you'll see that the BMI class of '66 has the largest number of graduates killed in action in Vietnam. And I'm sure it's quite the same for the Naval Academy. They just came along at the time when things were really starting to heat up.
When you entered BMI, did you know what your major was going to be? And
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I knew as long as I didn't have to take anything but the minimum amount of math and science, I'd be happy. So I struck out as a history major from the start.
And then did you perceive that you were going to have a career in the military?
No.
Okay.
No, in fact, I was distinguished. I guess by being what we call a 4-year private, I had a little column that I would write for the cadet newspaper that we call clean sleeves, no stripes. Clean sleeves. And I knew that I would have, like everyone else in my class, in the mid-60s, a requirement to serve 2 years minimum of active duty time as a commissioned officers or lieutenant. And then typically the great majority of our BMI graduates would live up to that concept of the citizen soldier and return to duty with the reserve forces or maybe National Guard unit. And so, no, I didn't plan. I certainly didn't plan on spending 32 years in the U.S. Army, which I eventually did.
You would be voted least likely to be a general in your group at that point?
Without question. Without question. Although one of my classmates, Granny Amos, was more famous for being a really good football player than for being a really good soldier, but he was a Marine brigadier before he retired. Tom Lennon, Air Force brigadier, another, just an average fellow up there. But Rich Timmons, who was our senior ranking cadet in my senior year, first class, retired with 3 stars, and that was no surprise. Mm-hmm. He had his eyes set on an Army career from the very get-go.
Did the university have some way of marking the loss of students while you were there in the Vietnam conflict?
I don't recall any situation during my time there until 65 where there was an official announcement made, like at a parade or formation or something like that. Mm-hmm. Later it became standard practice. There were so many that the cadet corps would be in the dining hall, Crozet Hall, eating their usually midday meal, sometimes evening meal, and there would be a call to quiet, and they would announce that Lieutenant so-and-so had been killed in action and to attend private on such and such a day. And then they'd move on, it just went that way. The Virginia Military Institute today has modified its memorial service, which was held for years and years, on the 15th of May each year, in honor of those 10 cadets who were killed fighting in the battle at Newmarket in the Shenandoah Valley as part of a small Confederate force that turned back a larger Union force. That's changed now. We don't have a Memorial Day service for those Confederate cadets. Now it's a memorial service on that date for BMI graduates, men and women who died in the service of the country since the Institute was founded in 1839. So it's a different situation altogether.
Mm-hmm. But so how were you feeling being at BMI, knowing that you're going to have a certain amount of service, but you know that the war is getting more intense?
Yeah. Up until my graduation, 65, I'm very worried about that because the numbers of American troops serving there were still limited. Yes, we did have officers and non-commissioned officers serving as advisors to Vietnamese units. Yes, we did have special forces units increasingly being deployed, not just into South Vietnam, but also into Thailand. We had increased numbers of Air Force assets flying out of Utapao and other airfields in Thailand, Royal Thai Air Force bases. So we knew that was going on. But my orders reporting to active duty had me going out to Fort Knox, Kentucky, be there on the 2nd of January, 1966, Till then, do whatever you want in Mountcastle. So I went back to work for Philip Morris, where I'd worked in the summertime, which in those days, Philip Morris was a major employer in this area. And my wife and I got married, and we went on out there. And I was on orders to go to Fort Hood down in Texas, to the 1st Armored Division, because I trained as an armored officer, tank commander. But then just before we were to leave, something happened down at the Army Aviation Center at Fort Rucker in Alabama. A lieutenant who was actually, like me, armored cavalry officer, was leading a group of reconnaissance people on a mission, and he fell out of the helicopter in a rough landing and was injured. So they said, we need one of you guys to volunteer to go to Fort Rucker, Alabama. That's a lot closer than Fort Hood, Texas, to Richmond. I said, I'll go. And I went down there and spent a little over 6 months, a little more than 6 months. But at first I went there because I didn't want to go to Fort Hood. I left there because I didn't want to stay there. I had a number of my VMI classmates who came through Fort Rucker who were trained as helicopter pilots and then headed off to Vietnam. And we were close friends. In fact, on the 11th of September, I will speak at funeral service for Jack Frazier, who was one of my classmates who recently passed. And Jack was down there when we were there, and then went on to fly in Vietnam. And I'd been there about 6 months, and I thought, all these guys from my class are going over to serve. And I didn't like my company commander very much. I was working really hard. He would send me off to the PX to get him a pizza for lunch about 3 times a week. I'm thinking, wait a minute, I'm a lieutenant, I'm not supposed to be the pizza delivery man. And so I told my wife about it, and she said, well, what are you going to do? I said, sweetheart, if it's okay with you, I'm going to get out of here. And she said, you know where they're going to send you. You call them up to Washington. I said, yeah. I said, will you support me? I won't be happy, but I will. And I did call, and 3 days later, I had 50 copies of my orders for Vietnam. So we packed it up, came back to Richmond. She went back to Heritage High School, taught art history for art education for a year. Taught high school, by the way, is what she taught, while I was in Vietnam. And off I went. I got to Vietnam just before Christmas in 1966, just in time for Bob Hope's Christmas show to arrive at the play food at our division base camp.
And you attended?
Oh yeah, we all attended. We had an entire hillside filled with GIs. Bob was okay, but I mostly remember Joey Everett. She was beautiful.
Can I back you up a little bit?
Of course.
Was there any question of whether you were going into the Army in VMI? Did you try to think about going to any other branches?
No.
Okay.
No, I was headed for the Army. I was training there at VMI in the Army ROTC.
Okay.
In fact, in those days, now it's more of a generalized sort of training, but in those days, you picked your branch of service in the Army. And the Virginia National Guard had a platoon of tanks that they kept for our use at VMI. We learned how to drive and maintain those tanks while we were still undergraduates. They kept a battery's worth of 105 millimeter howitzers there for those cadets who were going to be artillerymen. And they offered a training program, in-flight training program for those men in the Army ROTC who wanted to be helicopter pilots. And so the little airport up there in Rockbridge County, they would learn how to fly Piper Cub or something like that. But that was a great experience for them. So, yeah, I knew I was going to the Army.
Okay. And how did you and your wife meet?
We went to high school together, but it was such a huge class. We had 500 graduates in 1961. Because once again, there were just two
High school.
schools, city high school. Now, you could go to a public school, a private school like St. Christopher's or Benedictine or St. Gertrude's or St. Catherine's, but if you were going to public school, it was a wonderful, wonderful school. It was excellent faculty, great education. I didn't realize how fortunate we were until I did get to college and bumped into classmates from other parts of the country that didn't have that advantage. Anyway, we just knew one another, but not
Didn't
well.
have romantic.
And she went, no, and she went off to school, to a little college down in what they call Peace College, as did a girl that grew up in my neighborhood in Ginter Park. Susan grew up in the West End of Richmond, and Ginter Park, and they were down at Peace together. I called several times to ask Gay to come up to BMI, but she had fallen under the spell of a guy from NC State, still a great guy, and she's still a great friend. And after my second year, sophomore year, I was back in Richmond, and we had so many of us from this area, we would have a summer party, you know, and we'd rent some space like some hunt club or something like that. And I said, would you go to this little party with me? It's a lot closer than Lexington. She said, yeah, well, okay. And we really hit it off. And so in August, just 2 months after graduating, we were married. In August of '65, we just celebrated our 58th anniversary here a week ago.
Congratulations.
And, it was great. And she has been the greatest gift I could ever have been given. She moved 29 times. in 32 years. I say she moved because on a number of those occasions I wasn't anywhere nearby. I was either going coming from Vietnam, or I had 3 tours of duty in Germany, a total of 10 years out of my 30 plus. And inevitably the Army would send a family over there, but they said, sorry, we don't have any government issued family quarters to offer you just now. You have to, if you want to take your wife and kids, that's fine, but you got to find a place to live, as I said, on the economy in a little village, which we always did. And we're going to be separated from at the whim of the Army's bureaucracy. So she'd go, and then we'd apply for government housing, and we'd get it eventually. I'd get a call from back at my headquarters when I was up, say, on the border. Hey, Captain Mountcastle, this Mountcastle called, y'all got quarters on post. The German guys are coming tomorrow and move her. So she said, don't go back to the village, come instead to quarters number such and such, here at Ferris Barracks. And she would make it all happen. And we're getting ready to move again now after 18 years at Crossroads, when it's 55 and older, places that popped up like mushrooms all over Richmond 20 years ago. We've been in this one home for 18 years. And she's talking to a lady from the moving company that's telling her how much it's going to cost us to move to Avery Point, which is where we're going. A lot of our friends are living and enjoying it. We're heading that way probably December or January. Once again, Susan has been in charge.
She knows what to do. Okay, well, let's get back to you arrived in Vietnam. It's Christmas. Is this your first time out of the country?
Yeah. I've never been anywhere. To me, that trip to Washington, D.C. was a big deal. Virginia Beach, big deal. So that flight to Vietnam was totally different. Had a chance to spend a day in San Francisco because the plane that was supposed to take us that evening to Saigon broke down, so they said, okay, Lieutenant, you can hang around San Francisco. Come out tomorrow. The plane will be fixed by then. I went down to Fisherman's Wharf. I'd heard all about that. I said, that would be a good place for lunch. And there was a restaurant, a famous one, that my taxi driver told me about called Stone's. I went in there, and I had on my lieutenant's uniform. And it was packed, lunchtime. And I started to leave, and then the maitre d' came up and grabbed me and said, sir, Lieutenant, don't leave. Mr. Johnson from Crocker National Bank over there with his group, they want you to join them for lunch. That's a good deal. So I went over there, and this fellow, he's not as old as I am now, but he was pretty old. You know, World War I lieutenant. He's in his 70s, and he could tell I was heading toward Vietnam. Sit down and have lunch with us, and he talked to me about what it was like to be a 22-year-old lieutenant in combat with a bunch of kids that didn't want to be there, but were. And I've never forgotten is taking the time and making the effort to do that now. Trench warfare in the Meuse-Argonne Forest, not the same as commanding a tank platoon in Pleiku province, but the basic ideas you got across on leadership are extremely valuable. Listen, get to know your men, understand what's important to them. And if they'll share information with you about their families back home, listen. Listen. And I did.
Did you ever get to write him a thank you note or anything?
I didn't. I got over there thinking, that'd be a nice thing to do, but once I got there, it's
You
time
had
for-
lots of things
I
to
got-
do.
I didn't even send a letter to Susan or one to my mother. I tried to do a good job of keeping her posted. Probably a couple of weeks because we were rushing around through the processing. They loaded us up with enough material. I had to say, where's the Army mule that's going to carry all this stuff for me? Carry it yourself. Stack it up on the back of the tank. And off I went.
But what were your first impressions getting off the plane?
It stinks. We got off at Benoit, which is an airport right outside Saigon. It was as humid as it is outside here in Richmond today. It smelled bad. It smelled like old vegetables and rotten food. After a day or so, you don't notice it, but getting off of that Stretch 8 aircraft, yeah. In fact, I think the last thing I smelled was a very nice perfume on one of the flight attendants. A lady. It's just that lady flight attendants in those days. And then took 2 steps down into the, morass that was Saigon. And on the way from the airport to what was called Camp Alpha, we were being processed. We passed an American MP Jeep with the remains of 2 Marines inside that had just been blown up. Apparently, somebody that was unhappy with the American presence had thrown a grenade in the back of their Jeep and killed them both. And so we passed by the soldier driving our school bus said, that's why these bars on the windows try to keep the grenades out. So we just sat right in our chairs, very, very quietly until we could get to Camp Alpha.
So you got processed and
I did.
and you were given lots of supplies.
Lots of stuff, and then they gave me a flight number and a manifest on a fairly good-sized cargo aircraft, the C-130. Got on that C-130, flew up to Pleiku, which is part of the Vietnamese Cordillera, the mountain chain that runs from North Vietnam all the way down to central South Vietnam. And that was where the 3rd Brigade of the 25th Infantry Division was located, along with most of the 4th Infantry Division, which had come over from the States later. The 25th was in Hawaii when it deployed to Vietnam. And they were already up there in the Highlands when the 4th Division joined them. And so now we had this big camp, and that's where we landed. We had another week of processing and so forth. And then I got my assignment. And I went to the 1st Battalion of the 69th Armored Regiment, which had come over from Hawaii with the 25th Division. Army divisions in those days had a tank battalion in each division. So whether it was the 4th Armored Division in Nuremberg, Germany, where they had a lot of tank battalions, or even an infantry division like the 25th Tropic Lightning Division in Hawaii, had just one. But it also had an armored cavalry squadron, so it wasn't all foot soldiers. And the only unit that I can think of that was a really significant American unit that didn't have any tanks assigned was the 1st Cavalry, Air Cavalry Division. They were infantry or air mobile units all the time. But the regular infantry divisions, like the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, the 4th Infantry Division, the Ivy League, the 25th Division, yeah, they all had a tank battalion.
So then you get your assignment and you meet your soldiers.
Right.
How is it?
It was good.
I assume there's some integration.
I met my company commander first, and he was a great guy, Bill Fitzgerald, former West Point football player, great company commander, captain. He said, okay, Mountcastle, you're going 3rd Platoon. We got to replace the platoon leader who was wounded 2 weeks ago. You're the first one in, so you get to be the new 3rd Platoon leader. And I met my platoon sergeant, the senior sergeant right away, Silas C. Carter. She was old enough to almost, father. He was a World War II veteran.
Wow.
And the company first sergeant, who was a senior sergeant for our whole company, B company, that Captain Fitzgerald commanded, was also a World War II veteran. So here I was, January 1966, these old guys, and my sergeants were all older than I was. Almost all of them had been serving where most of our tank units were located in Germany. The U.S. Army never, I don't think, as an organization, never dreamed, nor did the Defense Department dream that, some 40 or 50 years after the end of World War II, we would have so many troops still in Europe. We went through the period of being an occupying force, and then, of course, NATO was developed in order to serve as a buffer for the USSR, which was increasingly controlling all of Eastern Europe. And so it was not at all rare to find, as I did, that each one of my sergeants had come to Vietnam straight from a place like Schweinfurt or Nuremberg or, Gelsenkirchen or some such place as that. And they were all good NCOs. I didn't have one who was a problem. My gunner, Mac McConnell, had been a staff sergeant, and then he got in a little trouble with some Germans. So he was only wearing 3 stripes instead of 3 in a rocker, but he got his rank back because he did a very good job for me, and we got him promoted.
Did you feel like the World War II veterans were helpful? Their experience?
No, they were great guys. And later on, 1971, I showed up in Germany to command as a captain now a tank company at one of our forces in Germany, and I walked in, and who was the first sergeant there? Same guy who'd been in Vietnam. And things had changed a lot. He had a new wife, beautiful, young German lady. And although South Carter has passed on, Trudy Carter's still alive. We still send our Christmas cards back and forth. Yeah. Great gal.
What was it like trying to navigate a tank in the Vietnamese terrain?
Hard, really hard. You know, this predates all the GPS technology that has existed really since about the time of Shield Desert Storm, where in the desert in Saudi Arabia and whether Kuwait, you know, our tank units were introduced to GPS technology, saying, well, I can't see it, nothing but sand out here, but it says here on my little screen that we're right here. And we're told that there's a bunch of enemy troops up here about half a mile away, so we can't see them yet, but let's hope for them. Vietnam, we didn't have that, all we had was paper maps. And the best we could do was try to get what help we could. If we had anyone up above in a helicopter, we'd say, okay, you're going to hit a stream in another 10 minutes or so. Looks to me, he says, from the helicopter, if you bear left a little, you can hit a low spire crossing spot in that stream where you can get your 60-ton tanks across without getting stuck. So that's the way we did it. But of course, with a Continental D12 diesel engine and those metal tracks clanking on, we weren't going to sneak up sort of, communists, be they Viet Cong, in other words, typically South Vietnamese communists who were fighting under the direction of the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, and equipped and supported by the North Vietnamese, or North Vietnamese troops themselves who had been moved into South Vietnam. We fought both of them out near the Cambodian border, which is where we were operating for my entire first year. North and south, mountains, hills, forest. But back to your original question, one of the photos I have in here, I took just over the top of my cannon, my 90mm gun tube sticking out. And it's nothing but a mass of green branches and leaves. And sometimes I'd have to get off the tank with my compass in hand, step out away from that big pile of iron that would throw off my compass, and take a compass reading. Okay, we're supposed to be heading east according to the map, but it looks like we're going northeast, so let's go a little further to the right, and we'll hit east, see if we can make it. And that could be dangerous too. One of my tank commanders was leading a little column of our 5 tanks, and he said, I need to take a compass reading. I can't see anything, Lieutenant. I said, go ahead. And he had only taken 10 to 15 steps away from the tank before he started getting fired upon back. No, that means we couldn't see. So we just reacted to that. As soon as he could scamper back to his tank, we opened fire on that area. And there was no more forest there, no more North Vietnamese there once we had fired what we call canister, which was like big shotgun shells. Trees, people, all the stuff would go flying. And then we went on about our business, but it was dangerous to be out there on the ground by yourself. And that's why whenever we could have infantry soldiers to assist us, to help secure us, we really appreciated that, because they were much more flexible in their ability to hop off of the tank and get away from the tank, which was making so much noise, but they could do a better job of hearing sounds and could alert us to the fact that, hey, Lieutenant, there's a bunch of people over here to the right that we couldn't see or hear. But frequently we didn't have any infantry support. And we did have a recurring challenge with our commanders at the lieutenant colonel level. I had several that I was sent to work for, detached, take your platoon to Mountcastle and go out here to the 1st of the 8th Infantry. You'll meet the colonel out there. He'll tell you what he wants you to do for him. I would say things like, "Oh yes, Lieutenant, now you're here with your tank. Sounded very nice. How about conducting a mounted recon of this area?" I'm thinking to myself, it's been a long time since you thought at all about what we're doing here in this terrain. Mounted recon? Well, we may be mounted, but the people doing the recon, the reconnaissance, so the Vietnamese, they can hear us coming.
Mm-hmm.
But we did the best we could.
So now you're going out in tanks, looking for enemy, I assume, but then you're going back to the base at the end
Yeah,
of
we
the day?
go back to what we call a fire base, usually. And there was almost always some damage that had to be repaired. And frequently, large helicopters, the CH-47 Chinook would come in with a great big rubber bladder full of diesel fuel. And we had these little hand pumps, and we'd be refueling our tanks because there was no roads to where we were going. We'd made our own road to this hilltop where there might be an infantry battalion that had been operating out there for 2 weeks, and now we were there to support them. And same thing if we needed parts, same thing if we needed ammunition. So it was hard work, day and night. And that's why our soldiers always look forward to an opportunity and we always try to get them out on what we call R&R, rest and recreation leave, about a week-long trip away from Vietnam altogether at no expense. You go to Hong Kong, you go to Singapore, you go to Kuala Lumpur. And if you were married, you could go to Hawaii. So my first year, when I finally got a break, I couldn't go to Hawaii because my wife was busy teaching school at Hermitage High School. So I went to Hong Kong. Because I wasn't planning on staying in the Army. So I said, I'll go to Hong Kong, get those great Chinese tailors to make me some business clothes. So when I go back to Richmond, finish my 2 years of active duty, when I get home from Vietnam, which I will have done, I can go back to work in Fort Myers. So I went to Hong Kong then, but then, of course, second time we were married, and then we definitely met in Hawaii and had a wonderful time.
Was it hard to go back?
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
about things you do, like when you're doing something really hard and then you
Yeah,
take a
it
break.
would be hard. It's funny how you get accustomed to a particular region. And in that part of the world, you had different seasons. You had the wet season, the dry season, the monsoon, and the rains. And it wasn't the same everywhere. So you could be up in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, like I was toward the end of my first year's tour of duty over there, up in Con Tum province in the large battle of Dak To. And I had to fly down to the coast to pick up some special parts that we couldn't get any other way. And luckily, a friend was able to fly me down there. And I couldn't believe it was warm and dry, and the sky was perfectly blue. And up there where we were, it was raining, and it was actually cold at night in the heights. But it's a fascinating part of the world. It's like for Virginians going to the Western United States, which is such a different experience for Virginians. We're so used to having visual references. There's a barn, there's a tree, there's a telephone pole, here's a fence, there's a cow. You get out to someplace like Fort Irwin in the desert at the National Training Center, there's nothing there. There's no trees, there's no cows, there's no fences. It's just emptiness. It's sort of that way in the Orient. It's different.
Did you So your first tour, how did you celebrate holidays during that time? You came at Christmas time, and then, you know, you probably, so you had like Easter and things. Was there no celebration of the holidays?
No, every day was pretty much the same. We had a battalion chaplain, and he was a good guy, but he wasn't very effective. He would try and help soldiers if they had a family problem back in the States, you know, but he wasn't someone who'd say, okay, Easter's coming up, let's get together and
Have a
we'll talk
service.
about the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. No. In Christmas time, Red Cross families would send stuff. It might get there in time for Christmas. And, you know, the people would give each other little presents, you know, that they'd gotten. But it wasn't a major event. If you happened to be in a place like I was in December when Bravo came, yeah. But like my second Christmas in Vietnam was memorable mainly because I could hear Armed Forces Network coming out of Saigon, you know, playing Christmas carols. And by that time, my assistant advisor to the Vietnamese unit I was with was a Sergeant Perez from Puerto Rico, and he was Catholic, and he was really having a tough time missing his wife and 2 little kids. And there was a tiny little Catholic chapel right close to our base. And he said, that by that time I was a captain, and I go to, they're having a service on Christmas Eve, and I go, I said, you know, it's going to be in Vietnamese. He said, I don't care. I know the service. And so I said, yeah, I'm a Baptist, but I'll go with you. We went, this guy was 6'2". He just towered over these tiny Vietnamese, but they were all Roman Catholic. They weren't Buddhist. And they were so nice to us that, you know, we felt like we were truly welcome there in their little chapel. And I still remember looking up at Sergeant Perez and the tears running down his face, you know, as he thought about his wife and babies back in at Fort Knox, Kentucky, wishing he was there. You know. But that was a memorable Christmas.
How did you feel about your food that you ate while you were in the military, the rations and
This is not bad, you know. The United States Army got to be quite adept at providing fairly nutritious, not always really tasty, but fairly nutritious canned food to soldiers during the Second World War, and that kept up through Vietnam long before the meals ready to eat came along, which that now sort of standard. And we had our own mess team, but usually I was so frequently away with my platoon from the rest of my unit. We just ate what we could get out of our cans. Helicopters would bring out what they called a sundry. Here's a bunch of stuff for you, a sundry pack, and it was designed for an infantry platoon for weeks. There'd be some candy, there'd be cigarettes, there'd be Band-Aids and stuff like that. There'd be, you know, some difference from the standard issue ration, and so we would enjoy that. But it was food to live by, not gourmet food by any stretch. And then when I was with the Vietnamese, boy, eating fish heads and rice, not very exciting. And my first assistant at second tour of duty was an Australian, because the Australian Army had advisors there as well. worn our Celeste boots of the Royal Australian Army Armored Corps. And his wife would send him food from Sydney. And there was always 2 cans of Thua Slag Ale, which had a picture of Sydney Harbor on the can. It was a special treat. And Lester would share his Vegemite with me, and we would sit there at night after the Vietnamese had all gone to sleep. We'd be sitting there by their side, Captain Lop's personal carrier, really having fun just speaking English, you know. Lop could speak French, and he could, of course, Vietnamese. A tough time with English, and I didn't speak much French, so I could get by in Vietnamese. So it was great to have Lester to talk to.
Did you go to language school while you were in? No, you just picked up
We had
Vietnamese.
little minor series of Vietnamese language training for those that were that we knew we were going to be advisors to Vietnamese unit. They conducted some of those down at Fort Bragg, now Fort Victory in Fayetteville, North Carolina. It lasted about a week, and you could get by. I'd learned enough my first year over there, just in the very most basic sort of conversation with Vietnamese, to sort of get by. But as an advisor with them all the time, my language skills improved quite a bit. And then after 6 months of being an advisor with this cavalry unit on the ground with Captain Lott, my senior American, full colonel, said, "Look, Colonel, we let's okay, Mountcastle, done enough. We're going to bring you back here to Quang, where the division headquarters is located. We want to make you advisor to the staff officer we call the G3 Air. We need an American to make sure we're communicating effectively with the U.S. Air Force, which is flying B-52s and so forth out of Guam to provide bombing support for us. And we need to be able to communicate with the American helicopter pilots in the 101st Airborne, which is our next unit over. We do a wonderful job of supporting us. Oh, and for sure, we need to make sure we can communicate with those marvelous pilots that flew the, what we call dust-off, medical evacuation helicopters, because they didn't make any difference. If a wounded soldier was Vietnamese, if he needed to be evacuated, typically to an American emergency surgical hospital, those American pilots would come in, just like they would for Americans, and pick up the wounded and take them away. So I went down to, I left my Vietnamese cavalry friends and went down to Hue, beautiful old imperial capital of Vietnam. Met General Trong, No Von Trong, probably the best general in all of South Vietnam. And I introduced myself, saluted, and said, I'm the G3 Air Advisor. He said, no, Mountcastle, you not advisor, you G3 Air. Captain Thien, he be dead. He be dead yesterday. You, G3 Air. A little more than I planned for, but that's what I did. My last 5 months in country, I was really the guy. I trained up a couple more Vietnamese, neither of which displayed much in the way of talent as far as dealing with a flight of B-52s coming out of Anderson Air Force Base on Guam and putting their arc light strikes in to the Ashell Valley where General Trump wanted them, but I did what I could. It was an interesting experience, spending that much time in the air.
How did your predecessor die?
It was shot down, and he died in a helicopter crash. We were shot down, but luckily I was flying with an American and a great pilot. And he set us down even though the tail rotor was just about gone. And it was a very fortunate day for me because there were more American helicopters in the air around us. And before long, we had another chopper who somehow managed to squeeze it into this little hole in the forest. And off we went. They came back the next day to get the helicopter and found that it had been pretty badly stripped by the North Vietnamese for anything that they thought they might get used, might be able to use, but I was safe. In fact, I came through 2 years over there without a Purple Heart, and felt very, very fortunate. As it turned out, 2004, I had to go down to MCV and get a very young and extraordinarily talented neurosurgeon, Scott Graham, to fuse 3 cervical vertebrae of my neck that had been damaged in a big mine explosion my first tour. But I still had my arms and legs, and my tank driver didn't. So I felt real fortunate in the fact that my neck hurt pretty badly for quite some time. Didn't really bother me at all because I still had all my limbs. But after trying a series of Army doctors, finally after I retired, my wonderful family physician here in Richmond said, "I'm going to send you down there to see this neurosurgeon, and something's not right." And I went, and sure enough, that explosion had banged my feet up with such power that it had really hurt my upper neck, my cervical spine. But he did a great job. And after all those years, 2004 to 2023, I'm doing fine.
So you feel you have good range of motion?
Got six screws and a titanium pin plate in there, but I can look up and down. One of my tours that I led for the Virginia Historical Society, we were in Rome, and we were trying to look at some of the beautiful paintings on the Sistine Chapel. And Pam C., who was the vice president for development, I said, "Jack, can't you see that?" I said, "I'm trying to, but if you'll help me, I can." Because I couldn't bend my neck back quite far enough to really appreciate everything that everyone else was saying. But yeah, he did a great job.
I'm glad that they were able to give you some relief after all the time.
Me too.
So what were the racial relations between, you had people that were Black and you had people who were Hispanic that were serving with you in your platoon? What were the racial relations like?
Well, first trip over there in 67, mostly 67, I had one staff sergeant who was Black, one of my tank commanders, and he did a fine job. We had, of course, Dwight Johnson, not in my platoon, but in my company, and
He's in that
quiet, young soldier, tank driver, did a great job. You found in this 67 time period, you found more Black soldiers in infantry units than you did in like artillery or aviation or tank units. And then by the second time when I went back, we were starting to, people who filled the different units in Vietnam were reflecting the difficult period we had in this country, 68, 69 into 70. You had more difficulty between Black and white soldiers, especially if the white soldier happened to be a sergeant or officer in the field, in active combat. That stuff was sort of pushed aside. But once you're out of the combat and you're back in a relatively safe area, then the different racial attitudes would come to the fore. And we had problems between white and black soldiers on bases. But in my particular case, my second trip being spent almost exclusively with Vietnamese people, and except for Son Perez, my assistant for a while, who was from Puerto Rico, almost everybody during that tour of duty that I dealt with, a limited number of Americans, almost all white people. There weren't very many black officers who were there as advisors to Vietnamese units. It was mostly white guys. But I can remember thinking, 1970, actually, I'm kind of fortunate to be here working with this group of professional advisors, almost all of whom had been to Vietnam at least once before, and now back again on the second tour of duty. I'm really fortunate to be here because units, American units, not too far away, Marine and Army units not too far away, are having more and more racial difficulties in their camps and so forth. So we stayed pretty much away from that area altogether.
Do you think, from just an expert, like that we've noticed from the interviews, that maybe later on drug use becomes more of an issue in with the military? That they had places where people could dry out, or testing before they couldn't go back. They had to be clean before they went back to the U.S. Do you think that the racial issues combined with people maybe trying to cope with everything that they're going through?
I don't think I really have anything that I can offer as personal experience in that regard, because once again, as an advisor, we finished up our tour of duty, they sent us to Saigon, got us cleaned up, gave us some gongs to wear, and sent us home. And that was about it. So I didn't really have any really exposure to that challenge of guys who'd gotten very used to hash and other fairly strong drugs that were going to cause them problems when they got home if they didn't manage to find a way out.
Did you, can I back up and ask you about your first interactions with the enemy forces?
Yeah.
Did you have any impressions when you first intercepted them?
Yeah, my first impression occurred then 2 weeks after taking command of that platoon. We were moved away from the base where we'd been operating. I was sent to look at an area to see if it could be used to establish a new base, with ideas being, okay, we could maybe move the whole company to this base and leave the battalion back here where they're set up in a larger fire base. And as we were breaking out of a line of trees heading across a dry rice paddy, the first rocket-propelled grenade, RPG, as we refer to it, Russian-made anti-tank weapon, fired right toward one of my tanks. Sergeant West, who had a slight speech impediment, couldn't say his tank number 33. It was always tweet, tweet. Tweet 6 is tweet, tweet. RPG coming at me right now. And then luckily, my platoon sergeant could see where it had been fired from, tree line across that rice paddy. So we just opened fire on that tree line, and I luckily still had radio contact with my company base. They were able to bring up a flight of helicopter gunships that were close by on a different mission. And thanks to them, they rolled in on that tree line and fired it up pretty well with their machine guns and fired some rockets in there. And then we moved across the dried rice paddy, which could handle our tanks no problem since it was dry. And we found the remnants of some of those North Vietnamese troops that had been working there, plus several RPG launchers that they hadn't had a chance to use. But I thought to myself, this thing sort of quieted down. I said, well, this is what it's going to be like. I'm going to have to be prepared to be surprised, because they're going to see me, they're going to hear me long before I hear and see them. And we're just going to have to be very, very adept at responding to this kind of fire. And that basically set the tone for most of the combat that we were in. The North Vietnamese and the VC were very clever about the use of anti-tank mines, because these people understood the ground. They knew where, if we were going to cross a stream, we would have to cross the stream where it was shallow and had a gravel bottom, so we wouldn't get stuck. So, biggest mine I hit with my tank was not a mine at all. It was an unexploded American aerial bomb, and they had figured out where we would cross, and it did a lot of damage. Hurt my neck. But it was always difficult fixing those tanks again after you'd hit a big mine, because they were 60 tons and we were in the jungle or in the forest or in the mud, and drag them back to a place where you could secure yourself. Frequently during the night, we'd go right back together, sort of like the old Western pictures of circling the wagons, we back our tanks together with the guns pulled. And then hopefully we get the parts we needed to fix our tanks. And we got pretty good at it. And I think maybe one of the nicest things anybody ever said to me or about me when I was a lieutenant was not anyone in my unit. We had been sent out to assist C Troop 3rd and 4th Armored Cavalry Regiment, so we were working for a different unit, captain, good man, and we had, as we typically did, we hit a couple of mines and we were working real hard to fix it. We got ourselves back inside their wire. We were working hard, and toward the end of the day, it was almost dark. It was time to visit the men's room, which was an old bunk bed frame with a couple of holes and a plywood cover. And I'm sitting there in the evening next to this very fat, red-headed mechanic from C Troop 3-Quarter Cat. He was their senior sergeant mechanic. We're talking about fishing. And he said, by the way, LT, the soldiers have been bragging on you about how hard you've been working. He says, don't get yourself too tired out now. I said, well, thank you. And that was like that's a long time ago. It was like February 1967. And I still remember him saying they've been bragging on you and how hard you work. Thinking back to the guy at lunch in San Francisco, get to know your men, make sure they know you, care about them. So that turned out to be pretty good advice.
But even the person that was telling you that your troops were bragging on you, they're kind of telling you to self-care yourself.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he said, you know, you can't do it all. And that was good advice too. He'd been in the Army a lot longer than I had. But, you know, I just the thought of watching these young privates and young sergeants working so hard, so determined to get their tank back running again like it should be. I couldn't just stand around and observe them. I had to at least hold something for them, or pound something for them, you know. I had to do something.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad I did.
But the I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
General protocol, like if you guys hit a mine and you can't move anymore, you're supposed to get to a safe place, and then you helicoptered in these parts that you needed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we had recovery vehicles, big ones. We call it the M88 vehicle, tank recovery, VTR. And if they could reach us, they would. But they were not heavily armed, and so that would require some more tanks to come and help fix the third platoon. No, third platoon. So we had these very strong steel cables, we call tow cables, and we had hooks on the front and hooks on the back of the tanks. So we would sometimes have to, if the track was completely broken, we couldn't motivate ourselves. So we would hook one, sometimes two tanks with these cross cables to the dead tank and drag it behind us back to a safe point, at least where there was enough open sky so that we could get some parts in by helicopter. Or if in the course of that action any of our folks had been injured, we could get them out on a medevac helicopter. So we got pretty good at that, but it was hard work. Remember, I got home from Vietnam the first time. I'd lost about 25, maybe 30 pounds. I wasn't fat when I went, but I was really skinny. And Susan said, "Okay, now that you're back, where do you want to go?" I said, "No, we just go somewhere, get a hamburger." Okay. And this is December '67, year after I left. We went out on guard. They had a place called Shoney's Big Boy. It's a hamburger place. Went in there. He has three friends from high school. They looked at me and said, "Jack, I haven't seen you in a long time. Have you been sick?" I said, "No, I've not been sick. Been in Vietnam." And that ended the conversation.
They didn't ask any questions?
That's okay. See ya. And that was it. I mentioned that in this 50 years on exhibit that we have at the Virginia War Memorial. Because coming home, that's what I noticed both times. Richmond had changed almost not at all. It was pretty much the same. Mm-hmm. And the second time I was over there, we had a little boy by that time. But my mother-in-law, one of my all-time favorite people in all the world, was a retired school teacher. And she would watch Russell, our little son. On my way to Susan, we'd go down to the McGuire Veterans Hospital and volunteer in the spinal cord injury ward. And she took me down there to meet some of her patients down there. I thought to myself, you know, nothing's changed in Richmond. Everything has changed for this 19-year-old boy. He's never going to walk again. And that, I guess, maybe not a unique experience for me, but I was impressed with the fact that, you know, Vietnam's a long way away. And what was going on over there. You know, you could listen to FM, Good Morning Vietnam, but nobody was listening to that back here. And what they were seeing, of course, was people saying, "Y'all know I won't go," or, you know, "Let's get out of Vietnam right now." They had a chance, and you will be talking to people who worked very diligently to try and end America's involvement in Vietnam with your project, of course. And they were, as far as I can tell, very few were just marginally committed. They were very committed to doing whatever they could do to try and convince America's leaders that this is not going anywhere. We're not building a new country. It's not going to ever look like the United States of America, you know, but with Oriental features. No, it's not. And they were right. It didn't. It didn't work. Although I see that our president's getting ready to go to Vietnam, you know, and visit here soon. Sometimes when I put on my Jackson underwear, I notice it's made in Vietnam. I got a pair of running shoes at home made in Vietnam. And the country itself seems to have undergone quite a significant change from what Ho Chi Minh had in mind in 1975. You know, it's not the same.
Have you been back?
No.
Would you ever go back?
Too old. And to be honest, places where I spent so much of my time, with the possible exception of the city of Hue, which is a lovely, I mean, it's the old imperial capital of Indochina, you know, Vietnam. But I didn't lose anything in Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City, and had never been to Hanoi. So a number of veterans have gone back, especially some, as you know, of course, so well. Paul Galante's friends who have gone back to revisit their time in the Hanoi Hilton. But I won't go back.
You mentioned in your survey that you were involved in a brutal fight at Jack Toe. Do you have any remembrances you want to share about that particular?
Yeah, that was real difficult because this was in the lead-in phases toward the Tet Offensive of 1968. Here we are in late 1967. Dak To province, which you can see on that little map, north of Pleiku province. High mountains, North Vietnamese troops moved into the area. Americans responded because there was a special forces camp up there. The Americans created a larger airfield, moved up a brigade, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, moved into the region, sent up troops from, by this time we had switched our shoulder patches from the tropic lighting of the 25th Division to the 4th Division. They just said, okay, let's take the 3rd Brigade of the 4th, which is down here near Saigon, and make that the 3rd Brigade of the 25th. 3rd Brigade of the 25th, which is up near Pleiku, we'll make that the 3rd and 4th, so we put on new shoulder patches. But we went up there, and it was not our entire battalion at all. The other companies were still heavily engaged in other parts of western part of South Vietnam, but our company was there. And we were doing everything that we could to support the infantry units from the 4th Division, the 173rd Airborne Brigade. And we're fighting the North Vietnamese infantry who had infiltrated the area before the Americans arrived and had a chance to build significant fortifications on the hills overlooking the airstrip And from those hills, they fired artillery into the airstrip. I got pictures, my little picture. Thumb drive here, 2 American C-130s destroyed in one afternoon by communist artillery fire. The infantry lost, American infantry lost so many people that they didn't have enough helicopters to bring out to kill in action. So we were tasked to go and get them.
With your tanks?
We did. And I won't forget that, because those men deserved the best that we could give them, which at the time meant a couple of guys on a body bag throwing them up on the back of the tank. And we're carefully driving back down the hillside until we can get them down to the graves registration unit down by the airstrip. And that was just a couple of weeks before Dwight Johnson was in the action in mid-January, for which he was awarded the Medal of Honor, because we were pretty well surrounded by North Vietnamese troops. And the idea, as we read about later, was to ensure that places like Dak To and the Marine base out of Khe Sanh, out near the Laotian border, American attention would be drawn directly
To distract
to
you.
ongoing fighting, Khe Sanh, Dak To, and so forth. And we would be not so inclined to notice the steady movement of infiltration of troops through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, through Laos, Cambodia, and then into South Vietnam, targeting places like Saigon. And so in that regard, they were successful, because we were heavily engaged up there. And I felt very fortunate when I flew from Dak To down to Pleiku, heading home. Old First Sergeant Frank Newhouse told me, "All right, Lieutenant, get on the damn helicopter. Go on home. We'll see you again." He somehow knew that Philip Morris was not the career I would end up with. And in that regard, he was right. But I flew down there, and one of my closest friends in the unit had purposely missed his flight home, because we had flown over together. We'd fought together all year. And he waited for me. And when our C-130 landed at Pleiku Air Base, with me, Air Force Loadmaster, and one guy from Graves Registration in the back of that aircraft, and all the rest were dead. It was totally filled, stacked up three high with dead Americans from Dak To.
Are they in the coffins?
Bags.
Yeah.
And so from there, they'd be sent down to the coast, where Graves registration units operating in large capacity would put them in shipping containers, make sure that they got their fingerprints or teeth or dental records or something to identify them. But I thought, man, I'm a fortunate fellow to get on.
It's a hard way to leave, though. How did you feel about the American effort at that point and the South Vietnamese? Did you feel like you had made progress?
Looking back, as I was getting on an aircraft, as we call it, the Freedom Bird, looking back over some hills, and saw a flight of F-4s heading north, thinking, well, I remember Mountcastle thinking we'd be driving down the main street in North Vietnam here for very long. You know, it'd be like marching through Paris in 1940. And in Hanoi, and of course we weren't marching through any cities. Only marching going on was in Washington, D.C.
With the protests.
So,
Did you know at all about the protests? Like, did you hear about protests?
not much, but there was some mention of it in the Pacific edition of the Stars and Stripes newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And we would get these lightweight versions of Newsweek that they would mail over, Newsweek publishers would mail. And there'd be some information there. But most of the families of our soldiers didn't write down. I'm so sorry that you're stuck there in Vietnam because Cousin Billy has just had a wonderful time on the weekend, you know, protesting the war in Vietnam. We didn't get very much in the way of specific information. We had enough on our plate right there to keep our attention.
You said you kept up with writing your mom, and were you able to get mail back and forth?
Yeah, we did pretty well with that. And she was interested in my impressions. I sent her some photos from Hong Kong, which she thought were amazing. And there's a product called Tiger Balm that was, you know, sort of like pain medicine or something. And they have a big area in Hong Kong called Tiger Balm Gardens with all these Chinese figures, painted figures, and I took some pictures and sent them home. She was amazed. It was, you know, a lot different than her experience in Richmond, Virginia, as a person. There was no indication of anything having to do with Sir Walter Raleigh or Jamestown or the House of Burgesses. It was really different.
Yeah. Were they sending you any care packages?
I told them not to try and send too much because we were way out on the end of the supply line, so to speak. But occasionally she would, you know, bake some cookies and send them over there in a box. And sometimes they got there in pretty good shape. You know, we could share them around the tank room at least, and do that. But it was a long way away. And in the early 60s, they weren't given much space in the mail to package delivery. It was mostly letters. And in our case, of course, it didn't cost us to send a letter back to the States. There was no postage. We just wrote postage free up there, you know, and they could see we're coming from APO San Francisco, such and such a number, so it didn't cost us anything.
Did you ever make a call?
Not in the first time, because they had not worked out the system yet. But the second time, I was able to make 2 or 3 calls, and luckily, I was able to get Susan on the phone a couple of times. Other times, I would typically not call her at the apartment that she and our little boy Russell were living in, because she was gone so frequently. I would call her parents' home on Parham Road in Weston and Rackham. Sometimes she'd be there. We could chat for a few minutes, and you know, hi dear, it's me, Jack, over. Oh, how are you doing? Are you okay? Is everything safe? Over. And so that ham radio operator out in Seattle or Portland, Oregon, or wherever, he'd switch the radio over, so we talked back and forth that way. Actually, a couple of the best phone calls I got was with her Aunt Dorothy, who was always been, bless her heart, she was one of my all-time favorite relatives. She was so funny, and she lived in Pennsylvania until she was quite elderly. And she finally sold her house up in Pennsylvania and moved down to live with Susan's parents in Richmond. But she was great. She always had a joke. I would be disappointed not to get Susan, but the Van Dark one is okay.
Yeah.
That was okay.
How did you guys blow off steam in your first tour?
Um,
Did you have any sports you played?
There was no place to play sports. Some guys would, we had a couple of baseballs, throw baseballs around. But we were almost always stuck on a little small base. Now, I will say this. We did, when we were back, when our company was back near the battalion base, they had a volleyball net, and some volleyballs, and we could play volleyball. And we had this magnificent battalion commander, Paul S. Williams, and he was one of the best senior officers I knew during my entire time in the Army. And he would, it was amazing, he'd come out there and play volleyball, actually pretty good. And he was real busy all the time, working really, really hard. The radio operators always run up to Colonel Williams, take this message. Colonel Williams, got to take this message. And he'd deal with it. But he got to know the truck drivers' names, the medics' names. Williams told me, as he was leaving, just a month before I did, Mountcastle, the company commander says, "You're going back to Richmond, you're going to go work for Philip Morris." Is that right? I said, "Oh, yes, sir." He said, "All right, have a good time, work hard, because you're going to get bored." You're going to get bored, Mountcastle. We need you back here on the tanks. Well, I thanked him, and he left. He got his medal, he left. But 3, maybe 4 months after I was back here going to work, very well dressed.
Were you wearing your suit from your
The
trip?
phone rang one night at our apartment, our little apartment off of Devonshire Road out here, off of Monument Avenue, and it's Colonel Williams, now full Colonel Williams, not Lieutenant Colonel Williams. He's heading Armor Assignment Branch up in Washington. Mountcastle. Colonel Williams. Bored yet? I said, "Sir, I'm working hard here. You're training me to be the export production coordinator." He said, "You bored yet?" I said, "I miss my soldiers." And he told me then, he said, "Oh, we got a tank company waiting for you out at Fort Riley, Kansas. Just wanted you to know that." He said, "But of course, said one other thing. You come back, we're going to make you a regular Army officer. And we're also going to send you right back to Vietnam." So I hung up the phone and I thought for a long time. And I sat down with Susan and we talked. And I'll never forget. She was going to do. It's going to make you happy. What will make you happy will make me happy. And so I went back into the Army, went out to Fort Riley. We had our firstborn. And sure enough, within about 9 months after getting to Fort Riley, I had my orders in hand. I'm getting back to Vietnam for that second tour as an advisor. And Susan and Russell came back to Richmond and waited for me here. But that Williams, this is all spun off of your question about playing and recreation. Because my dad died when I was I say 14, I just turned 15. I thought to myself many a time, 23 years old, I could be real old, I could be an old guy like Williams, maybe 40 years old. It's pretty old, but I could be like him. Well, he retired with 3 stars. I was at his funeral up in Arlington when he was buried there. ceremony affected me. I've been to a lot of funerals in Arlington. 2 weeks ago, I was up there with another friend. But that particular funeral, Paul S. Williams, one of the most selfless people I knew. You know, even when he was a Corps commander in Germany, a big wig, he would go into the mess hall to see how the cooks are doing. He would go at night down into the motor pools to see how these exhausted, dirty, greasy kids were doing, you know, fixing this truck. Look around, he's a guy with 3 stars on. You want to know where they're from? How long they've been there? Need a Band-Aid for that? It was wonderful. It's a VMI grant too. Made me feel good.
So, how was your opinion? You'd been to Vietnam. You had Johnson was president when you first went to Vietnam. The second time you go to Vietnam, Nixon is president, right? How did you feel? And you seem like you're a person that, like Emily's hypothesis about people start out kind of a patriotic duty, and then they kind of gradually realize that what we're doing there isn't going to work.
You try and maintain a positive mental attitude. My old first sergeant remembered PMA, positive mental attitude. But by 69, when I went back, I had definitely gotten over all sorts of hopes and dreams about a victory parade in Hanoi. You know, this is not going to happen. And I thought, here we've got this new program that we're going to call it Vietnamization. We're going to assist the Vietnamese armed forces to become more highly professionalized. And if we can set a good example for them, perhaps they will become more directly responsive to the civil government down in Saigon. And if our political leaders in Washington can set the best possible example for the leadership of South Vietnam, President Thua, then perhaps it will get better. But I wasn't waiting to see that happen anytime soon. And I had basically, with Susan's support, I had made my commitment. And yeah, I got promoted to captain. Yes, I got assigned as a regular Army officer. I was no longer a reservist on active duty like I'd been as the first, my first tour. Like most, 90% of us were coming out of VMI. That's what we were. We were going to do 2 years of active and then 4 years of reserve. No, now I'm a career soldier. And I made that commitment. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't universally hailed by any means. My mother, for instance, not at all happy. She was a widow lady living in Richmond, Virginia. Her son's leaving again. You know, why don't you stay here and be a good son like you're supposed to? I had 2 cousins, both of whom were Virginia Tech grads, both of whom had served their time, their 2 years in the Army, and come back and were now working, one in Newport News, one in Richmond, working for VDOT. You know, that would be perfect, and my job at Philip Morris was one that she thought was a really good deal. But I just, I felt I had to do my best because I'd made this commitment. And frankly, that was probably a strong component of my service. You know, you burn that bridge behind you. You can't turn around and say, hey, I'd like to come back. Mm-hmm. No. Now you're a career soldier. Do your best. And that carried me through, you know, the second tour certainly. But then from that point on, 3 tours of duty in Germany, 10 years over there. When I got word toward the end of my first tour duty that, to our amazement, says my battalion commander, even though you're not a West Pointer, here's a letter from the history department of West Point. And we know, Mountcastle, you're not one of the best and brightest, but they want to send you to Duke to get your graduate program done so you can go to West Point and teach history. What do you think of that? Sounds like a deal to me.
How did they pinpoint you?
They were looking for people who were non-West Pointers. I guess it was an affirmative action program of sorts at West Point in the early to mid 70s. And a former superintendent at VMI, and years later, Cy Bunting, was up there teaching history, and he said, there's a couple of guys that you might think about. One is this guy, Mountcastle. He's just been selected as aide-de-camp, commanding general, 1st Armored Division in Germany, the VMI history major. And he got a couple of the history professors at VMI said, yeah, I like Mountcastle's paper that he wrote. And so they did. They sent me to Duke. And
Did you want to go to Duke, or were you told to go to Duke?
They mostly sent you where professors were teaching that they wanted
You to kind of be.
they wanted people to have studied with these particular professors. So we went to Ohio State, or Rice, or Duke, or UNC. In my case, they sent me to Duke. There were a number of Army officers at Duke in different departments who were going to, they were there, the Army was paying, thank you, American taxpayer. The Army was paying to get them a master's degree, and then they would go teach at West Point or be what was called a tactical officer. So they'd give them a bunch of psychology courses to take, you know. And so I went, and it was funny because when I got there, my professor, Dr. Theodore Ropp, had me in and started talking about it, and he kept using this word dissertation, and I didn't know what he was. I said, well, I know I'm supposed to write a thesis for my master. This guy's talking about a dissertation. And then one of my friends had been there, he explained, he said, look, Rob expects you to take the overloaded courses, go to school all during the summer, and you're going to be here 2 full years. You got enough time if you pass both your foreign languages and get a good thesis in. They'll give you, let you be a PhD candidate in absentia and send you on your way and give you 2 years to write your dissertation, which is what happened. And then luckily for me at West Point, I had a great history department head who said, usually in the summer, we send our history instructors out to the summer camp for the soldiers so they can work on the rifle range. But Mountcastle, I'm going to let you stay home and write your dissertation.
What was it about?
The development and the employment of incendiary weapons by the United States during World War II, which was something that this country had stated without question we would never, ever do anything that horrible to people. And of course, the people in places like Dresden, Germany, or Tokyo said, oh, yes, you would. And yes, we did. But all of that worked toward just responding to that commitment that Colonel Williams made to us. And that's why I said on my little plaque down there at the War Memorial that one person that is the reason I made a career in the Army. It's Paul Williams. No one else. Just the example he set for me. And I'll always be grateful for that. Whether it was, in grad school down in Durham, wonderful experience. Quite so wonderful playing racquetball with Mike Krzyzewski up at he was a great racquetball player, also a great basketball coach at that time. But he used to like to take me over to the racquetball court about once or twice a week whenever I could subject myself to some of these. Great guy. Susan and Mickey Krzyzewski would go to the same hairdresser in that little town of Highland Falls. So we've been Coach K and Mickey fans ever since he went to Duke.
So, I mean, did you it seems like it just kind of like happened, like that you became a PhD, and you know, like it just was just they were like, you're gonna go, and this is what you're gonna do.
It was one of those things that just happened, and I was fortunate enough to be able to take the opportunity when it was presented and to be willing to work hard. My commander, Joe, this is just before I went down to work for the two-star down at Division Headquarters. My commander was always wondering, he said, okay, look, Mountcastle, get in your Volkswagen van, drive fast as you can. I'm going to give you a week's leave. I want you to leave. We were near Nuremberg, leave Germany. I want you to go to Verdun, the big World War I battlefield, then make it to Normandy. Don't go into Paris, whatever you do, or you'll never get out of that. Go around Paris, get to Normandy, then scoot up to Bastogne in Belgium on the way back. Come back to the Rhine, see the bridge of Remagen that the Americans captured and got across the Rhine in early 1945, and then be back here in a week, and we've got to go to the field again. So, and off I went. And my plan was pretty simple. I took enough coffee and enough sea rations in my sleeping bag in my little Volkswagen van. Spent every other night in the van. And on odd nights, I'd find a little French hotel or something. And I got to Normandy that way. Went into the little town of Saint Mary de Lys. American paratroopers had landed just before dawn on D-Day. One of them caught in the church steeple. He hangs there still in his parachute. The French people have kept a life like mannequin of an American paratrooper hanging from their church. And I didn't know any French that really could get by. So I went into a restaurant called Les Jean Steele, named for PFC John Steele from North Carolina. Got stuck out at church. Ordered an omelette, s'il vous plaît. And pretty soon the lady that ran the restaurant said, I see, Monsieur Valladolid, small hair. You are American, are you? Oui. She said, welcome to Saint Mary. Your omelet. I started reaching on my In 5 minutes, 3 nurses came in. Not nurses, nuns came in. And they had a nunnery there. And they wanted to meet me because the word had gotten out that this American officer was there. I was just a captain. But they came over, and they could all speak some English. And they said, will you come with us after lunch? We'll show you. We got in there. Central Highlands, took a quick drive around St. Mary Place. We stopped at the nunnery. We got out and walked around to the back of the building. And there, right at chest height, all these bullet holes across the concrete wall. And so the Germans had stood 7 American paratroopers and killed them on that morning, D-Day morning. And the nun said, we do not regret. We do not forget. And I've been back to St. Mary Place many times since, leading tours and taking my officers from units in Germany later back to Normandy. I've not been back to the nunnery. The nunnery's still there, but it was too hard for me. Because I thought about those boys, they were all young. They were herded in by the Germans. Stand against the wall, shrine, and they shot them. I don't want to see that again. But they got a nice museum there. And the John Steele restaurant's still in operation. So if you ever go, stop in the St. Mary.
Do you, I like to ask people, they go to the Vietnam War Memorial, how your reaction is to the War Memorial, and then also how you like to commemorate the loss of your soldiers in your own personal way.
Yes, and in fact, I've been supporting in a modest way the Vietnam Memorial Association ever since it was formed. been to the memorial on a number of occasions. There's a couple of names I'll specifically look for. Chuck Arnold, Spotswood DeWitt, Thomas Jefferson High School class of 1960. Good man. He and I were serving in the same unit, same general unit over there at the same time when he was killed in action. And I looked up at those names on the wall. But when I was in the Pentagon for 3 years in the mid-'80s, we had to get out for exercise. We simply could not stay in that building all day, every day. So we had something called POAC, the Pentagon Officers Athletic Center Program. We go down there, make sure your work was done for the morning. Instead of going to some restaurant and sitting around at the snack bar in the Pentagon, go down there and quickly get out of uniform, put on your running clothes, run across Memorial Bridge, and run down the mall, past the Vietnam Memorial, down the mall toward the Washington Monument, come back, take a quick shower, get back to work. And I would pass the wall with all those names, you know, and think about those fellows. And there's some women on the wall. And then think about their families, you know, and how they were doing. This was back in the mid-'80s, so it's just, 15 years since the Vietnam War ended. And I would think about that, and I've been back on a number of occasions. When we think about Vietnam and its impact, not too long ago, Ken Burns did one of his grand epics on Vietnam. And our local PBS station hosted a sort of an introduction to the production. They asked me to introduce that, speak to the group that had gathered here at Virginia Historical Society, and I was glad to do so. Just to say, this is probably the first serious attempt. This is not a Hollywood movie. This is real stuff. It's not just Americans. It's Vietnamese peasants. It's widows. It's families talking about the impact of this difficult war. And I was glad Ken Burns had one of my brain cramps that old people get now. The lady that worked with him on that, his partner in production, she did a great job. And they all did. And I thought, can I think about that? You know? But as far as specific Vietnam things, I'm so glad that you're doing this here. And I'm glad that Clay and the staff at the Virginia War Memorial thought about the 50 years on. And sadly, on the 11th, I'm going to be speaking at a funeral for one of the men whose pictures is on the wall down there. Might be my classmate, Jack Frazier, who flew a helicopter in the 48th Assault Helicopter in Vietnam. So I'll be thinking about Jack. And when I think about Chuck Aaron Holt, that lonely headstone out there on the Williamsburg Road, all these unknown U.S. soldier, unknown U.S. soldier, unknown U.S. soldier, unknown U.S. soldier from 1864. No dog tags in those days, you know, just a dead Union soldier. You get back to the far, far shook stomach. Think about how much has happened since Chuck passed. A lot. And I was taking a tour, a group, back to Normandy some years ago. And we had a World War II veteran. This was back in 2004, I think. A World War II veteran in the group. As soon as our bus stopped at the U.S. Normandy Cemetery that had sung around, Mr. Johnson, I think was his name, hopped up pretty quick, got off the bus ahead of us, and shot straight out into that field of Stars of David and white crosses. And his wife came more slowly. I said, "Where's he going?" She looked at me, "Oh, it's always this way. He wants to go and tell Sergeant Brown what's happened since we were here last."
Mm-hmm.
I thought, damn, 1944, that was a long time ago. It was 2004. And sure enough, there he was, resting his hand on Sergeant Brown's cross, telling him about what's gone on in the world since he was there 10 years earlier. I thought, when I watched the movie Saving Private Ryan, you know, and the initial scene and then the closing of the movie the same way, you know, visiting the American captain that brought his team to find young soldier. I thought, Saving Private Ryan all over again. I watched it happen for real, you know. So that's when I think about it.
Could we go back to your second tour when you were an advisor? You were working with General Quang. What was the mission at that point for him? Were you working in air support or
He
something
was the commander of the 1st Infantry Division,
else? Okay.
Army of the Republic of Vietnam,
Uh-huh.
which was, insofar as most Americans felt, unquestionably the best division in the South Vietnamese Army.
Mm-hmm.
General Trong was very demanding, but of no one as much as of himself.
Mm-hmm.
He was determined to do the very best he could for his country. And a lot of the officers that served under his command were from the North. They had been born there near Hanoi, Haiphong, they were Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
And they were invited to leave if they didn't want to become communist. And their families, for the most part, said, "I don't think so, we're going south."
Mm-hmm.
And so they left in '54 and came south. Von Lott, my cavalry captain that I worked with, was a Catholic, had been raised as a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Still a nominal Christian, a little cow-eye mixed in with it as well, but there it was. And General Trung was fantastic, and he was concerned about American air support because it was so very important.
Mm-hmm.
That when I got word, if I would be on duty at night, as I typically was, in the Tactical Operations Center, that, yep, this request that you got for this particular grid square on the map to be targeted tomorrow, there'll be a flight of 3 B-52s that'll be overhead tomorrow at about 10 a.m. your time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still want it there? It was my job then to hop in my Jeep, drive quickly to General Trung's quarters, his home, go up and get the guard at the front door to let me in. And there would be General Trung and Mrs. Trung and 2 little Trungs, and I would have the map. I didn't have to talk much. I had the time, 3 B-52s, that place on the map. And he would say yes, in English, yes, or no, and move it 1 kilometer west, or 2 kilometers north. I'd make the note, take it back, run back through channels to the Air Force. And he never said no, he always said yes. What the ground commanders asked for is what the U.S. Air Force is going to deliver. It'll be a bad day for the folks in that piece of junk. And sure enough, so he wouldn't tell the field commanders what was happening. Why? Well, because too many of them would then brag about the fact that, well, I suggested to General Trump we have this Arclight strike here. It's going to happen. It's going to happen at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Listen carefully. No, he wouldn't tell them. He would just, now, of course, he wouldn't allow American B-52 bombers to drop a load of bombs on one of his units. Wouldn't, of course, do that. But he wouldn't tell them this is coming. And there would be a flurry of radio calls, right after the B-52s had dropped their bombs and left. So, my God, what just happened here? And they would say, well, must have been a secret strike. So he was very good in that regard. Now, when the war ended, he had been promoted. He was no longer commanding the division. He was down near Da Nang, large city. Managed to escape from Da Nang, was not captured, made it to Northern Virginia, lived in Northern Virginia for about 10 years with his family before passing away. He's a very good officer, good man.
What were you doing or thinking when Saigon fell?
I was down at Duke. A number of us down there. Getting ready to go up to teach at West Point. It was a hard day. I think I'm not a big drinker, but I had 2 or 3 stout drinks when I got home that night. Just sat out on our little back deck in the apartment that we were living in while I was down there. And talked to one of my fellow Army officer students who lived just a few doors away. We agreed that it sucks. And it was very disappointing because we had gradually, of course, from 72 on, and after the 73 Paris Peace Accords, basically our troops were no longer directly engaged with enemy forces. And so we had that much distance. I was a lot more involved at that point with preparing myself to try and do a good job up at West Point than I was thinking about Vietnam. But that came as an intrusion. I knew that the North Vietnamese rapidly taken over South Vietnam. I mean, that had been on the news, TV news at night. Vietnamese fleeing on any way they could. Sort of reminded me a bit of Afghans trying to jump into the wheel wells of C-17s flying out of Baghdad, 2 years ago. Same kind of deal. But it was still a long way away. But what I found when I came back to the States after the second tour, the Army said, okay, Mountcastle, we know that you've always had this heartfelt desire to go to jump school and jump out of airplanes. I sort of forgot about that. We're going to send you down to Georgia. You're going to go to jump school, and then, rather than send you back to the armor school for your 6-month advanced course, send you down to the infantry school. I think you'll be there already. And you can represent our branch with the infantry. There'll be a couple of artillery guys there too, but no problem with them. So I went down there and in class, the Army had already, the institutional educational branch in the Army, had already sort of pushed Vietnam away into the background. And we were once again deeply concerned about the Nuremberg group of approaches, the Fulda Gap, and the 8th Guards Tank Army of the Soviet Union capturing Frankfurt. You know, coming through at 2 in the morning in a snowstorm and busting through the border. And so when I finished the course at Benning, they sent me to Germany, and there I was to do my bit, you know, to avoid the Russians from capturing West Germany, because they had pretty well sewed up everything else through what was then Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, you know, and of course East Germany, everything. So that's what the focus was. So yeah, Vietnam was sort of fading in the background. And it wasn't until, I guess, late 70s that Hollywood picked it up and said, oh yeah, let's make some movies.
Do you want some water? Do you want any water?
Yeah.
I guess it.
I'll take one too.
Water break. Okay, so we were talking about how Vietnam was kind of not the focus of the military by the time they sent you to Germany, and you were more in a kind of Cold War stance of, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And we had just a very few people joining us in Germany after 71 who were actually coming back from a recent tour in Vietnam. We had one major that joined us who then, as an advisor in the holdout Vietnamese fire base, assaulted by many North Vietnamese and luckily saved by the American Air Force. But there were very few, if any, combat troops, American infantry units, artillery units, tank units left in Vietnam. They were all
Unknown caller. It's okay.
I'm sorry. It says, my friend, potential spam.
Do you have more questions about what we were talking
I don't think so.
about? I want to know, how was it leaving your wife with a child for your second tour versus leaving just a wife?
Big difference. That's a big difference. First time over, you know, had all these VMI classmates coming through Daleville, Alabama, Southwind Mobile Villa, where we lived, and believe it or not, a duplex trailer. This man who had made his first million off of building up the area in Columbus, Georgia, to get ready for the first Air Division to go to Vietnam in '65, was going to make his second million off the flight school. So he put a trailer camp in there, and he took these 60-foot long house trailers, divided them into two 30 by 12-foot tiny little apartments, and rented them to lieutenants for exactly what we made when we get a housing allowance and not have both quarters. So there we were in Daleville, and a number of my VMI friends were there in flight school, plus others who were up the road in Columbus, Georgia, at what's then Fort Benning, going to jump school or whatever. They would come down on weekends just because there was nothing much to do in Columbus, Georgia on the weekend other than buy a used car. And so they would come down because we had a really nice officer club at Fort Rucker. They would just gorge themselves at Sunday brunch. And then waddle out to their cars and drive back up to Fort Benning, Georgia that afternoon. So that was something. Well, yeah, so many of us are going. Susan was a real good sport about it. She knew that I was getting very tired of going to the pizza on call to feed my fat captain. She knew that how I felt with my good friends. They were all good friends of mine from VMI heading to Vietnam. So she was wonderful about it. Second time, it came with this little baby in her arms and seeing me off, at the airport. It was different that time. Some tears. In fact, both of us. And it was wonderful when we could get together for R&R in Hawaii. And of course, little Russell, he didn't know who I was. So when I got home from that second tour in Vietnam, we got off the plane. In those days, you just walked down the stairs out of Richmond's Bird Airport. And there was Susan and Russell and some family and friends. I remember Russell kicking my shins because I was hugging and kissing his mother. A strange man hugging his mother. It was different. It really was. And when I got to Hawaii, we let us off a plane to our flight, and a crowd of us walked in there. And suddenly, out of nowhere, comes this really good-looking blonde gal hugging me and giving me big kisses. And I thought, oh, Susan doesn't see this. Well, it turned out it was Susan. She was blonde then, and she had a really pretty dress and had a great tan, and she'd been on #1 of her diet programs, and it really worked. So we had a wonderful 6 days together in Honolulu and seeing different parts of Hawaii. So yeah, that was a good experience for us. And as I told the lady this morning who arrived at our house in Glen Allen just as I was leaving to come here, Susan moved 29 times in 32 years. And I say, Susan moved, because many of those times I wasn't even there. I was in Vietnam or frequently in Germany, because when the U.S. moved into Germany in 45, we never dreamed that we would still be there in strength, in 75, much less 85, 95. And so we just moved into these little small, old, antique German installations. I put some concrete in the parking lot or something like that. Eventually built a commissary, a grocery store, a PX. That'd be about it. And so that meant if you got promoted or got a new job, it wouldn't be like just driving across post to a different building. No. It could very well be packing up everything, the kids, the dog, the bicycles, what little furniture you were able to take with you, and driving 50 kilometers down the Autobahn to the division headquarters down there, which is what we had to do when I got selected after 2 years of company command, tank company command. And then the general said, I want you to come be my aide de camp. So down we went. Well, but there was no house to move into there on post, Army quarters. So we had to rent, as we had before, another little, house in a little German village. We lived there for about 3 months, and then they said, oh, you'll be so happy to know, we now have a place for you to live. You'll be very much closer to the general, so you can be there instantly when he wants you. And so I had to tell Frau Maurer, our lovely old landlady, Frau Maurer, we got to go. And because of the status of forces agreement between the United States and Germany, we were not fined for breaking a 1-year lease because it was orders. So off we went. Well, that's another move. And you think about it, 3 tours of Germany, all those moves, 29 times. We told the lady who came today, because she's going to look through our house in Glen Allen, we're moving to Avery Point, either December or January, and she's figuring out, okay, here's what we're going to move, this is what it's going to cost, this is what you're going to stay. You've got a niece coming to get this stuff from Pennsylvania, that's good, you know. She's done it all.
Did your wife find much community, or did she get involved in the military wives community?
Of course, yes, she did. That's another thing that's changed significantly. Family support groups, especially for units like ours, away from the United States, are incredibly important. And bless her heart, she did a wonderful job at every step. And as I got promoted from captain to lieutenant colonel to full colonel, she had more and more responsibility that came with the job.
She had a job too.
She sure did. And she would make sure, especially the young American wives that were there with their husbands, because the Army, when it became a volunteer Army in the early 70s, became increasingly a married Army. Well, you could have said, yeah, I'm going to join the Army, Betty, and I'm going to be gone for 3 years in Germany. You just stay here and I'll come back in 3 years and we'll see what's going to happen. No, mostly Betty would say, no, I'm not going to sit here. I'll go with you. We'll be together. And so that would mean finding a place in some little Dorf, you know, little village, and there would be Betty, who couldn't speak any
German.
And her husband, Bob, who was gone on his howitzer or his tank at the training area. So Susan would make sure that Betty's first sergeant's wife, Betty's lieutenant's wife at the head one, captain's wife at the head one, was looking out for Betty. And make sure that Betty was not alone.
And acclimated.
Yeah, and getting acclimated. That's exactly right. And later, as she had a chance, she's a painter, and as she had a chance to expand her horizons with her paint, she would go all over Bavaria, painting scenes that we still treasure, and supporting, once again, through sales like little bazaars, money to take care of Christmas presents for the children of our soldiers that we had there who might not have the money readily available to go to the post exchange and buy a lot of presents. They still wouldn't get a lot of presents, but they would get some. Sure, she would do that as well. My last 4 years in the Army, I was in Washington. I was heading the Center of Military History. And she was what was known then and is still now known as a Arlington lady. The heads of all the service branches want to ensure that no one from their branch of service is buried at Arlington Cemetery without someone being there to speak to the next of kin. And Susan was present for 51 burials during the 4 years that I was in Washington. And she would deliver a handwritten note to the wife for the mother or the father of the person being buried that day. And she would be escorted by some 19 or 20-year-old kid, you know, in the 3rd Infantry, the old guard, there at Arlington Cemetery. When we were up there for a funeral not long ago, she, you know, she's such a veteran of that. She's very familiar with every little thing. Like what the lady was saying, you know, she's handing this note to the wife of the officer who was being buried. Finally lost a tough fight with cancer, was being buried. So she, talking, whispering to me, saying, this is what she's saying.
She knew the protocols.
Yeah,
of
okay.
the service.
And she has been so selfless in trying to help young women who, because she remembers what it was like, wondering, is he okay tonight? Will he be okay tomorrow? She remembers, doesn't forget. And when our son was in Iraq, same thing. It's Clay, is he okay? I remember when he showed up having broken his leg when he was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. He landed with 1 foot in soft sand and 1 foot in concrete.
Oh.
And luckily, the foot that was broken, the ankle, was the left one, so he was still able to drive, with his right one, fine, which is good. He was still a bachelor at that point, so he was able to get around town. The marvelous downtown Fayetteville, North Carolina.
How did you feel about your son getting into the military?
He sort of surprised us. We had 2 boys. Russell was born first. He went to Randolph-Macon, had a wonderful experience there. I remember asking Russell, we were up in North Virginia, and when he finished high school, a massive school, Robinson High School in Fairfax County, I said, Russell, it's getting time for you to pick a college. Let's start making some trips. So we went to, we went to Madison, we went to Washington Lee, we went to Sydney, we went to Randolph-Macon. But he picked, we didn't go to VMI because he had no interest whatsoever in going to VMI. As he said, look, Dad, I've already had 18 years in the Army, I don't need any more marching. And luckily for him, the soccer coach at Randolph-Macon was a German guy, and Russell had learned to play soccer with Jürgen, Rolf, and Axel. His 3 little friends in our town, in Erlangen. And so he got some scholarship help there at Randolph-Macon and thoroughly enjoyed his time there. Clay, younger, was still in high school at Nuremberg, Germany, American high school, which was part of the Defense Department education system for American kids. And he walked in early in his senior year and said, Mom and Dad, I've decided I'm going to go to VMI. You could have knocked me over with a feather. I was not one of these VMI people that, just rhapsodize over the 4 years up there. It's a good place to be from, but not necessarily a great place to be at. But he went, and he was a much better cadet than I was. In fact, when he was commissioned, he was offered a commission in the regular Army, and he took it. And so he spent a little over 20 years in the Army before retiring. And they were way out near Seattle at the University of Washington. So the family didn't want to stay out there. And he had a job offer at what was called Fort Lee, where they were training a lot of Army officers who, rather than send them out to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, in the middle of the country, these were especially people assigned to the Department of Defense in Washington or maybe up at West Point on the faculty. They would send them down to Fort Lee to take a slightly abbreviated version of the Commanding General Staff Officers course, and Clay was the head of the history program teaching down there. So he was here, and then the job opened at the Virginia War Memorial, and he applied, and unbelievable, 7 years later, this summer, he's been in the job. And it's been a wonderful experience for him. He's thoroughly enjoyed it.
Good.
And we feel good for him.
Have you been involved in any VA programs, concerning being a veteran?
Well, I'm a member. I think I filled it out on my little form. I don't know if I'm supposed to leave it.
You can, if you would. We'll take it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a veteran of Foreign Wars, American Legion, Association of U.S. Army Military Officers Association of America. I've probably done less with veterans associations than I would have if I were not so committed to the assignments I had as a member of the adjunct faculty out at the University of Richmond in the Jefferson School, teaching undergrads a course in Civil War leadership, and also working with civilian groups and military and professional groups. I've taken company hierarchy from one company in Western Canada, and the guy that was the president was an American Civil War history buff. And their company had suddenly struck pay dirt with a big expansion. He said, how are we going to do this? I'm not prepared to, take half of my best people and send them to Los Angeles and the United States. He said, something like this happened once before in the States in '63. Both armies, Lee's army and Lincoln's army of the Potomac, had to change their leadership just before this big battle. Maybe we should go down there and spend a few days. So I was asked to be their guide, their discussion leader. You put people in blue jeans and comfortable shoes, and some surprising things happen on the battleground. Mm-hmm. This young lady in the back says, we're up on Little Round Top and talking about how people are getting there just in time, to save the ground for the Union. Young lady says, sir, this is like the Kennedy Project. You remember from last year? This Canadian turns around. Who's that? So that's Suzanne from Burgessing. Oh yeah. How long has she been with us? About 4 years. Suzanne didn't have a seat at the table for the weekly staff meeting. She had to sit in the corner, with the young people. But Suzanne had a brain. By the time they left 3 days later, several things have been accomplished. One, Suzanne had an appointment to go see the boss when they got back to Saskatchewan. Two, they had come to have quite a bit of appreciation for the difficulty that Lee had without his hero Stonewall Jackson, killed 6 weeks earlier. What George Meade had when he had just been put in command of the Union Army just 2 days before the battle broke out. Mm-hmm. He'd all figured that out. And, I had showed them the one bar in Gettysburg that had real Canadian beer. Not this cheap export beer that you could get anywhere. So I had hit a home run. And they now have 3 subsidiaries in the United States. And I still hear from them from time to time.
Well, what would you say is the biggest misconception about the Vietnam War?
That we Americans want to replicate our experience in World War II. That we were going to create a situation in which the civilian leadership of the Republic of Vietnam was going to establish not a bureaucratic form of government, but a democratic form of government, and that there would be local political leaders who would have the opportunity, given our involvement, to protect them from the enemy that had infiltrated the country, to become not just political leaders, but the recognized leader of their town, their village, their province. I think we all believed, because we had won the greatest conflict in world history on this planet, that surely dealing with a small country like this best army in the world, the best navy, the best air force. Surely we can build a country here that we can all be proud of. I mean, after all, didn't we, the United States, didn't we raise George C. Marshall? Didn't he get the Nobel Peace Prize for the Marshall Plan? Surely we can do this. We couldn't. We did not understand or fully appreciate, in my view, the lack of democratic ideals in the hearts and minds of those people wielding political power in the South. So our efforts were well-intentioned. There's a picture there of Dwight Johnson getting the Medal of Honor along with 4 other American soldiers. They went above and beyond Call of Duty. But it wasn't there. The material wasn't there. And so that's, I think, the greatest disappointment. And perhaps the thing that is most difficult when looking, once again, at those familiar names from the Vietnam Memorial in Washington.
Do you think it could have been there if people weren't invading and terrorizing the population?
I'm sorry?
Do you think that it would have been there if the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese weren't invading the southern region?
Well, there's still an intact government in Thailand. The one in Cambodia is not a democracy that we would particularly admire, but it's not a communist state. If there had not been the direct employment, and I think the effective employment of a variety of military forces by the Communist North, I think that the Republic of Vietnam may have been able to establish a relationship with an exponentially growing People's Republic of China, becoming involved with China in a number of opportunities through business contacts, and being not a communist state per se, like Ho Chi Minh had envisioned for the people in the North. They would, I think, have perhaps had an opportunity to develop more in the way of economic opportunities that were not directly related to their past as a French colonial holder. We won't know. But obviously, when you go into a village and you ask, where's the village chief? Since the BC came last night and killed the village chief and took his children, raped his wife, and left. It's hard to think about, wouldn't it be nice to have a democratic form of government here in our village? Or for that matter, you show up the day after troops from the Mountcastle division, the 23rd Infantry, had come into My Lai too, and killed dozens and dozens of unarmed civilians. Because they had been told again and again that the BC who were planning the booby traps and mines that were blowing their feet off every time they went out on patrol were coming out of My Lai. And so they went to My Lai, looking for the people that had caused them so much trouble over the past 6 months. I don't think they found any hardcore BC. All they found was people.
Mhm.
Sad chapter in our history, I think.
Mhm.
Nothing's black and white.
No, it's not. I still get a monthly newsletter well, used to be monthly, now it's quarterly if we're lucky, from the Veterans Association for the 69th Armored, the Black Panthers. But much like the letters, emails that I get from our class agent in the class of 1965 up at VMI, most of the news is not happy news. It's mostly sorry to report that former Sergeant Jones has passed away up in, Denver, Colorado. He'd had cancer for 2 years. You may remember him from our big fight down at Camloy, that sort of note, or from VMI, where in the past year, 11 members of the class of 65 have passed away. It's almost one a month. I mean, I'm 80 years old. It's going to happen. I know that. But it's all sort of fading away. When the 69th Armored Panther tracks comes, I read it, but I don't get happy about it. I don't get excited about going to another reunion, out in St. Louis or something like that. It's not something that is a major event for me.
Is there anything that you wish we would have asked you about your experience?
No, I think you did a great job of. Now, of course, I wandered from time to time off of Vietnam and into Germany and places like that.
It's all a part of your story. It's not just you. I mean, we're not just
Well,
interested in you in Vietnam.
I would say this,
Okay.
with that in passing. The fact that I ended up buying away the largest part of my adult life in military service in the U.S. Army, versus just the 2 or 3 years that an American may have spent in the Army, Marines, Air Force, whatever, in Vietnam back in the 1960s or 70s. That probably has an effect on me because to me, the faces looking at me out of the driver's compartment on a tank, that face, I remember that face from Docto or McGraw from here. When he said that about fixing this tank, was that up near Playku or at Hohenfels? It sort of blends together now because a tank is a tank is a tank. And I've been through many different types of them, but it's still hard work. At 2 in the morning when the track comes off and it's in a snowstorm, or in the case of Vietnam, in a rainstorm, you still got to fix it.
Yeah.
So it's hard. And that's probably why, for me, I don't know how many career veterans you will talk to as part of your project, but for me, it's sort of drifting away now a little bit. And it's like we think about how Richmond has changed. Let's see. Think about University of Richmond. There's a couple of guys up there that still able to make quite a contribution. Julian Hayter, for one, at the Jefferson School of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond. Julian has been asked again and again, what was it like coming to teach at the University of Richmond as a black man. The first black associate professor in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies. And he has given some great insights into what it was like, especially when discussions about what we're going to do at Monument Avenue, whether you're on CNN or, you know, NBC or whatnot. You go down to VCU, not right in the middle of campus, but just off campus a little bit. Bernard Means, professor in the art department at VCU, and what he does with his students is teach them how to make beautifully conceived and manufactured copies of Roman architects from England, Civil War equipment that can then be used in museums to look at history. You don't want to touch the original one, but his one looks exactly like it that his undergrads have created, you know. And he's done so much. So we see a change in Richmond over time, but it's a slow change as well. And I think with the passage of time, we'll all travel a little different, slightly different roads.
Our understanding of things changes over time.
Yeah.
Well,
How have you done on your list of people you want to talk to?
we're making progress.
Good for you. Good for you.
But I mean, there's always, you know, I just feel like the time is ticking away and we need to, you know.
It is. You know, they have honor flights now for Korean War veterans and Vietnam veterans up to Washington, D.C. to see the Korean War Memorial or the Vietnam Memorial. Go on to Arlington, watch the old guard there, watching the Tomb of the Unknowns. I don't know if you saw on TV a few weeks ago a little videotape of this guard from the 3rd Infantry marching back and forth through this terrible rainstorm, and the wind was howling and the rain was coming down in buckets, and the guard was marching back and forth, 21 steps, stop, 21 steps, stop, 21 steps, stop. She wouldn't quit. She stayed. She did her mission. But she did say later to the Washington Post, I was damn glad to get in on it.
Well, I'm going to thank you for taking your time today and being here with us and sharing your memories. And it was just really interesting to hear everything.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to next year and the opportunity that you have to share all this time and effort that you've made. Really. And we'll have a chance to come back next year and see what it looks like.
Yes.